Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parasha Talk. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malamed in Highland Park, New Jersey, at the Highland Park Conservative Temple Congregation, Anshe Emet. Joining me, my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler. How you doing, Barry? And Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky, Long Island and New York City, respectively. We are studying an amazing Parsha, Parasha Ki Tetzei. Just before we begin, we have to indicate the statistics, the Parsha stats. There are 110 verses in this Parsha. There are 74 mitzvot in this Parsha. There are 5,856 letters in this Parsha, 1,582 Hebrew words and 213 lines in a Torah scroll. But the one salient statistic is 74 mitzvot in 110 verses. That is a mitzvah density of 67.3%. What we're saying is this is the most mitzvah dense parsha in the Torah, and let's get started with it. We are starting with a set of 3 different areas of mitzvot that have to do with going into war. Ki tetzei la milchama ol oivecha, when you take the field against your enemies. What happens? What happens in this first instance? What is the Torah trying to do? And from that, we'll probably get into a whole conversation about the meaning of these mitzvot, perhaps the underpinning of the mitzvot, and what are the mitzvot trying to accomplish. Barry Chesler, tell us what this first mitzvah is about.
So we have the captive wife. A man on the battlefield spies a woman of the enemy nation who he is attracted to, and he wants to marry her. He has to bring her home. Cut her hair, let her nails grow, allow her a month to mourn her parents, and then he is able to marry her. And should he decide that at some point he no longer wishes her, whether before or after the marriage, he cannot sell her as a slave, but he must free her.
So this obviously sounds very difficult for a modern audience, a modern sensibility. But what do you think it was trying to accomplish this?
So I think this is the first of 3 related mitzvot. The second one has to do with a man with 2 wives who has a, let us call her a hated wife and a more beloved wife, rings a bell with the patriarch Jacob. And he's not allowed to disinherit the firstborn of the hated wife in favor of a child of the loved wife. And then we have the Ben Sorer Moreh. And in all 3 of these cases, the Torah is coming to curb behavior of the individual in favor of restricting that behavior and having a community or a higher standard make the decision. So with the captive wife, I think what we find most disturbing is the fact that the woman seems to be mistreated by having her hair cut off and her nails cut, but I think that it actually is the Torah's way of forcing the man to look at this woman as a woman and not as a sexual object. And only then can he make a decision to marry her. So rather than allow the soldier on the field, and we know from even the modern day that battlefield rape is a real phenomenon that has no easy solution, that this is an attempt to restrict the man's behavior and elevate the relationship in some way.
He's got a cooling off period of 30 days. There has to be a 30-day waiting period. And it says, via Shva, she has to go back to her home, or in your home. Uvachta et aviha ve'et ima. She has to go into a forced state of mourning. It's not so hard to see how it would be forced. She would be completely traumatized by this event. And so you're saying he has to see her as a human being, not as an object. Jeremy, you want to kind of comment?
Yeah, well, this is the Rashi says, which I assume is quoting something in Gemara or Midrash, Dibra Torah keneged yetzer hara, right? The Torah speaks to the human worst impulse, and I firmly agree with Barry that this is best seen as a reform rather than a legislation of the way things ought to be. We read it in the Torah. It's a mitzvah in the Torah. You at some level, the Torah is saying this is proper behavior, and you kind of want the Torah to say, no, this is terribly improper behavior, no battlefield rape. And instead, in a world that we can't imagine, there's a little bit of Game of Thrones style behavior here. We can't imagine the brutality, in the ancient world, but the Torah is saying exactly as you folks just said. The worst impulse of humanity is best restrained and channeled into things like giving the captive 30 days, sometime to mourn the fact that she has been wrenched from her people and is held by these other people. And if you shave her hair and let her fingernails grow long, at some level, I think that the rabbis think that she will no longer be attractive to the man who took her, and he will let her go. But it is a kind of reform, even though you would like the Torah to say, "Hey guys, don't do this at all. Let's not create an avenue by which you can do the less horrific." You kind of want the Torah to say, don't do anything horrific, don't do anything torturing. But instead, what we do have, I think, is a piece of legislation that says men on the battlefield can have their worst impulses just released. Don't do that. Restrain those most violent impulses.
So the Torah then moves into the set of laws regarding a man with two wives. And Jeremy, as you spoke, I'm thinking there is a lot of narrative connected to these laws. In fact, one of the ways to approach law is to figure out what's the story here. And Barry, you alluded to it because the Torah certainly knows of polygamous marriages. Our patriarch Jacob he had at least two wives that were real wives and two other wives. Abraham had more than one wife, but actually, Sarah and Hagar was a co-wife. And so in each of these cases, and Elkanah, the father of the prophet Shmuel, has two wives, Hannah and Penina. In each one of these situations, things don't end up very well. I remember it was Joseph Tilishkin. We had him as a guest speaker. He's a member of your show, right? And
he lives in my neighborhood, but he's not.
So he made the comment. He says, like, the Torah legislates on this, and everywhere else, it basically says, look, it doesn't work out well. This is not the ideal. And of course, it takes a few centuries for Judaism to get to the ideal of monogamy. But
there's something else that should be said here, though, and that is that one of my teachers, the late Stanley Kazin, Rabbi Stanley Kazin, one of our colleagues, suggested that there is law in the Torah that we have in Devarim, and then there's the narrative, and that's a counter text, but we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that the stories convey the actual happening. People went by the law. The firstborn got the extra portion, for example. And it's worth noting that with Samuel was given what he got from his mother, not from his father. We never hear anything about what Elkanah says about Shmuel. I don't think he speaks to Samuel in the book.
Absolutely.
So I want to ask about this, because it more than rings a bell, as Barry said. The words Ahuva and Snua are the words applied to Rachel and Leah, the beloved, and it doesn't mean hated the way, Snua doesn't mean hated the way, like, I hate you, but the unbeloved wife, the beloved and the unbeloved wife. And this is exactly what happens. Reuven is the firstborn, and yet Joseph is the one given the double portion. And so it's impossible to read this, not putting these two things together. And you can go one of a number of ways. I mean, you can say that perhaps Devarim, seeing all the bad stuff that happened with Jacob, legislates a different path. Or I think a little bit more likely, the law as expressed in Devarim in Parasha Talk Ki Tetzei this week is like the norm. And somehow the story of Jacob is to say that, norms are good like 99% of the time. But there are certain exceptional moments, maybe even redemptive moments, and characters like Joseph or characters like Jacob, whose behavior actually has to be antinomian and violate the norm. So I don't think there's any way to read the story, the story that it does not affirm that Joseph deserves, that his two sons get elevated to tribe level, that therefore making him the true Bechor, the Bechor Shor, the firstborn of the ox. And I don't think there's any way to read this passage without thinking, yeah, that's a bad way to go. So how do you put them together? Is the law a comment on the story? Is the story's power that it is a deviation from the law?
So what's interesting here is to think about Joseph for a moment. So his two sons are Menashe and Ephraim, and the favorite son there is Ephraim, the younger son, and Ephraim becomes associated with the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom, though, is associated with Yehuda, with Judah, who is the son of the unbeloved wife, and Judah is the dominant son in Jewish history over Ephraim. So that even in history, there's a kind of validation to the law, because even though Judah is not the firstborn, we could say that the top three sons discredited themselves with some of their activities. Reuven with his father's concubine, and Shimon and Levi with the story of Shechem and Hamor. And Yehuda is left standing as the oldest son of the first wife, and therefore receives the patrimony of the people.
So how would you then fit in the next passage, which is Ben Sorero Mored, the rebellious child? The Torah says, if a man has a wayward and defiant son, Sorer Umored, who does not heed his father or mother and does not obey them even after they discipline him. So the question then is this law? Is this speaking to a reality? Or as we would like to say, are we given here a snapshot of a society? Or would we ask that this is trying to comment on something? Is it giving a comment on anything? Is it?
Yeah.
And of course, if you recall, what's the rabbinic debate? Did this ever exist? Jeremy, want to weigh in on the?
Yeah. So first, I want to bring in a wonderful midrash that reads these three things in a little bit of a sequence. If you engage in this battlefield rape, even under the limiting conditions that are given, you will end up wrecking your family life, and you will have strife between you and your wife, and you will be prompted to discriminate against her child economically, and then in reaction, that child will become rebellious and incorrigible. And so it's that midrash, which never heard of feminism or never heard of Dr. Spock and child raising and whatever, recognize that the three things that are being restrained in these mitzvot are all a product of a life gone wrong. So it's not like these are the wonderful mitzvot, Torah mitzvot onai bara meirat einayim, the divine command, gladdens the heart and enlightens the eyes. These are statements of how to restrict yourself from going off the track and having your life as a mess. But I think that the Ben Sorero Mored, as you said, the rabbis and the Talmud argue that lo haya velo nivra never existed. Another person in that same debate, if I remember right, it's Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, says, not only did he exist, I stood on his grave. But the claim that this never existed says it's an allegory. It's not true. It is brought in the Torah to sharpen our study skills, to recognize the way that the Torah is telling us between the lines that this is impracticable and not, they say, for example, that the parents are supposed to come and say, they take him by the hand. Aha, they both have to have hands, and he doesn't listen to our voice. Aha, their voice has to be similar. The rabbis read out that the Torah between the lines sneakily is telling us this is not to be put in practice. But if we read past that rabbinic interpretation, I think that this too is a reform. You have to think oftentimes, and I think these are good examples of the Torah's laws, not as the picture of the perfect society, but the restraint on humans' worst impulses. I think that a case like this is that sometimes parents just lose it. They give up, and they could react to their children with violence, God forbid. So if you get a case like this and the parents have given up and they think that their kid is just impossible, what do you have to do? Aha, you are not permitted to take this into your own hands. You have to bring this to the elders of the town to turn what might be a private family disaster into a public judicial procedure in which you got a third party who might be able to cool things off. So to me, the whole thing is about bringing this incorrigible child to the attention of the city institution, and thereby restraining a parent's, right or capability or power to just abuse that child.
So I want to just comment on the word ziknei iro, the elders of the town, because while yes, they certainly could be seen as authoritative figures, and even with some legal authority, the precise term for a judge is a shofet. So there's something else going on here with the ziknei iro, and here I want to give a slightly more contemporary reading, which is that these people are just beside themselves. They don't know what to do with this child. And who do they go to? They need help. They go to people who are wise, ziknei iro, the elders of the town, who we assume are people who are mentor or experienced or know something about life and can offer some wisdom. Then they make the claim, they make the charge, B'nenu zeh sorerum, our child is rebellious, enenu shomeh b'koleinu, he doesn't listen to us, solel b'sobeh, he's a glutton. So the Zikanim have to hear this charge. Now, the next word is urgamuhu, they stone him. But in music, you have to read the rests. You have to read the pauses, okay? And I'd like to drive a big truck between these two verses and say, look, before you stone him, you got to work this out, right? It should never get to this point where you take a child out and do this. So the elders become in loco parentis. They stand in terms of, in the place of the parents, and they help remediate the situation. Look, today the contemporary example is, who do you go to? You go to a therapist. You go to a family therapist, a family counselor, and you work out the problem, because God forbid you should ever get to this. So I'm led to believe that this is more a theoretical case than an actual case. Barry.
Okay, I would have to disagree quite strongly with that approach. I think that we always have to ask ourselves what the problem is that the law is coming to solve. And the problem is not juvenile delinquency, as we often think, but it's more along the lines of what Jeremy suggested, is that it's a restraint on parental activity. And here it's important to recognize that the bottom line here is the child is executed. But he's not executed by the parents, he's executed by the town, by the elders. And so from the child's point of view, there's no difference in who executes them, but it makes a big difference to the community. And what's striking here is that the parents don't seem to be involved in the execution. Elsewhere in Devarim, it says that the witnesses have to actually throw the first stone in the stoning. They're not allowed to withdraw from the procedure. And then the other connection I would make is with the end of the Parsha, when we get to the story of Amalek. One of the readings of the story, which is difficult, I think we talked about it last year as well, is that evil exists and it has to be extirpated. It has to be removed. In the phrase of the Torah, uviarta hara mikirbecha, you have to uproot the evil from your midst. And we shouldn't think, in my opinion, at least, to disagree with you a little bit, Elliot, that these are theoretical, but it's a problem that all societies had to face.
I can't bring myself to imagining a situation where parents would actually charge their children and then face the execution of their child. I think that that's beyond even a sensibility of an ancient individual, and therefore I don't know if this is a kind of way out, but I would offer the following: that this is a theoretical violation of the fifth commandment, along the lines of the biblical scholar David Noel Friedman, who says, look, we find these very, very awkward stories in the first 5 books of the Torah, from Shemot, to violations of the 10 commandments. The golden calf is a violation of commandments 1 and 2. The blasphemer in Leviticus is a violation of commandment 3. The person gathering wood on Shabbat is a violation of commandment 4. And along that pattern, you would expect to have a violation of commandment 5. But the Torah can't conceive and present an actual case of someone being this defiant to their parents. So they create a theoretical case. And here in the theoretical case, you theoretically execute, but it lo haya v'lo nivra.
Elliot, first of all, I also think that there is great power in the lo haya v'lo nivra situation. But I just want to say that there are cases like you can't imagine imagine that a parent would do such a thing, and when chas v'chalila an abusive parent kills a child, it's like they're insane, they're wicked. But we can think of other societies, including some of our neighbors, where honor killings, like it's usually not because a young boy is a glutton and a drunkard, but maybe because a young girl has behaved sexually in ways that her family can't deal with, that do have, ostensibly, bat sorerau moredet, that, and I actually know somebody who witnessed an honor killing.
But are you saying that the Torah then validates this? The Torah cannot, I mean.
Okay, Elliot, you have to keep in mind there is a case in the Tanakh, not in the Torah, of a violation of Kibud Av V'Em. And it would be interesting if Friedman mentioned this, and that's the case of Avshalom, who rebels against his son, and in fact,
His father.
who rebels against his father, King David, and mounts a rebellion, and is killed. Not by David, that would support your case, as you can't imagine a parent killing his son, but by Yoav, who...
That's the point. I'm sorry to interrupt here. How does David respond to it? You have a whole, which
Well, I think
author
responded better by using the title for his greatest book.
Exactly.
No, absolutely. That's why David is so great in that passage, because he is overcome with emotion, but he does not fail to go to war with that son, knowing that this would be, a very likely outcome. So I actually think that we can't, if what we're trying to do, like, this is always the question in how we interpret passages like this. We interpret them on historical levels, and we give some answer that reads like that was then and this is now, and it's a different kind of culture and different kind of society. And we give like religious answers that we are studying the Torah, which is always meaningful and always speaking to us. And so we will say, on that level, we cannot imagine how the Torah would affirm that this is ever a reasonable way for a parent to act. And on the that was then, this is now level, I think we do have to say that plenty of societies think that certain violations are so horrible that people deserve to die. And it's a little hard for me not to think, given that those things still exist, and that given that the Torah has lots of death penalties for being mikoshesh etzim, being gathering sticks on Shabbat, that we can be totally confident that the Torah doesn't think that this is sometimes an appropriate response.
Okay, so we're going to leave that, then go to. I mean, I'm still emotionally involved in this. We're all parents, and I think we can't imagine any situation. We have the most perfect children, all of us.
So here, just one last word, Elliot, that it is hard to imagine, but as Jeremy reminded us, the last word in the passage in Masechet Sanhedrin is not lo haya v'lo yeh. It was the person saying, I stood on the grave of this guy. And there are two other events that the rabbis of the Talmud have difficulty imagining, and they each end with the same witness to its facticity. And sometimes you have to give the last word some credence.
Okay. I'm gonna underline your last word on that thing. I'm not gonna contest it, but I want to go on to another topic, which is, pick any one of the 74, and one of them is all, one of the most often quoted is the Shiluach HaKhan. What do you do if along the road you chance upon a bird's nest and you have to send with fledglings or eggs, and the mother is sitting over the fledglings on the eggs? Do not take the mother together with her young. You have to send the mother before you take the eggs. So the question then is really not a question of did this actually happen and what do you actually do, which of course we can deal with, but so what is the purpose of mitzvot? It's a philosophical debate. So Jeremy, weigh in on this. Mitzvot are for, end the sentence.
Well, I'm not sure that I have an answer for all mitzvot, but some of them are clearly some mitzvot are clearly about responding to a social need. But I would say that mitzvot are ultimately about refining the human religious personality, or the Jewish human religious personality. And there's a famous midrash we talked about a little bit before we started recording. Listen, what does God care? This is how the midrash goes. What does God care if you slaughter an animal across the throat, which is the halachic correct answer, or with a chop at the back of the head, which is forbidden? What difference does it make? Animal dies, you get hamburger. There's no practical difference, but God gave them litzrof bahemet habriot, to refine human beings, to not let us do whatever it is that we want, but to direct our actions and inculcate a sense of worship, intentionality, consciousness, and other kinds of virtues like generosity and chesed and kindness. So I would say that in general, the mitzvot are an attempt by this Jewish religious tradition to train us in behaviors which will bring forth our best virtues and refine us as people, help us be better people, and in turn make a better world.
Any other?
Yeah, what I would add here is that the purpose of the mitzvot is to make us more purposeful. We're supposed to think before we act. It's very tempting. You see the mother bird and the eggs to shoo away the mother, or to grab the eggs and have lunch. But the Torah is saying that you can't do that. And I think the answer perhaps is found in some way in the third paragraph of the Shema, Lo tatur acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem, that the mitzvot are designed to train us not to follow the inclinations of our eyes and our heart, but to think about what we're doing before we do it. And that is going to lift us spiritually.
But in this question, Elliot, do you, I think I said what I said about, and Barry said something similar about the general way in which mitzvot leave us different. But sometimes there are mitzvot which are clearly, teleological. They want to create some situation on the ground. So in your question about the shiluach hakan, the setting forth of the mother bird, are you sort of giving us two choices? It's to awaken our compassion, or it's a good animal husbandry that if you take the mother and the eggs, you're killing off the species in a way that's bad for the species.
So I don't think it has to do with animal husbandry. I think it has to do with the way we interact with animals, with nature. I do agree. Yes, of course, the ultimate end is to litzaref et adam, to refine the human character, and there is, I think, an element of us that relates to creatures as creatures. If you've ever had the experience of walking on a path and seeing Canadian geese, okay, with their young in the park, which they do around me, and you kind of stand near the little geese, the
Goslings.
The mothers go crazy. You see what maternal rage is all about next to these animals, and so you are definitely causing them distress. It's just part of nature, and so there is part of the Torah that responds to a deep understanding of nature in general. That all nature responds to the presence of their young with zeal, with zealous protective capacity. That's what a mother does. The mother is fiercely protective of her young. This is biological, this is innate, this is instinctive. And so we understand that on the deepest of levels. I think that yes, we can have it both ways here. We can say the mitzvot are to refine us and the mitzvot are to actually to be compassionate. I think we can have it both ways. All right, before we're running out of time here, I want to get your reactions, free associate, please. Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, Edomites, and Amalekites. Who wants to take Ammonites and Moabites for 20? Go ahead, Barry. Tell us. Yeah.
Here, what's interesting is you're not allowed to marry a Moabite or an Ammonite. And what the two have in common is they are the descendants of Lot. They are not actually biological descendants of Abraham. They're the descendants of one of Abraham's brothers. And they are, in a word, I guess, to borrow from a more modern language, treif. They are outside of the community. The other people can be brought into the community after a few generations. Except for the Amalekites, they are, I guess we would say treif l'gamrei. They're so treif that they have to be destroyed. But it does pose some interesting questions for who can actually enter our community and who cannot. And the modern take on this, of course, is that there are no descendants of these people today, so everyone can be welcomed into the Jewish community. But clearly there was some kind of test for our biblical ancestors because they did not accept everyone. But there's one interesting anecdote to share when the modern Israelis and the Egyptians were negotiating the Camp David Accords. They were in Egypt during Passover, and the protocol was that the Israelis had to host the Egyptians for a Seder. And they were a little nervous because, as we recall, the Egyptians don't come off so well in the Haggadah. But the Egyptians were not concerned because they did not see themselves as the descendants of those Egyptians. So lots of people have ideas of where they come from that don't always coincide with where we think they come from.
You know, an Egyptian person once told me, who was actually at a Seder of mine, that in Egyptian slang, pharaoh is the word for tyrant. So she could totally relate to the story about the badness of Pharaoh. They called, and this was before the Arab Spring, she said, yeah, we call Hosni Mubarak the Pharaoh. So yeah, I think as we said before we started recording, the last lap on this, Ellie, you should say the last lap on the Moab.
So as we're reflecting on it, I'm thinking, okay, so you know, the most prominent Moabite that we know of is Ruth. Ruth marries Boaz. She enters into solidarity with the Jewish people and then eventually becomes the great-grandmother of King David. You can't get more inside than that. And that's a kind of biblical answer to the ban against Moabites and Ammonites. I can't think of an Egyptian who enters into the people other than Hagar. Hagar, which is a quasi-matriarchal person in the life of Ishmael, certainly, but she has a place within the tradition. So there is a marriage of an Egyptian in the Bible. We don't have.
Solomon marries an Egyptian. One of his wives is.
Solomon. Do we have any marriages to Edomians? Any Edomite wives?
Well, first of all, also isn't the blasphemer, his father is Ishmi.
There you go. Okay. So,
yeah,
so we have a Mitzri, and there must be some. We're gonna look it up. There must be some Edomian around, Edomite. Okay, but we don't have any Amalekites. There are no Amalekite women. So here's my little.
Well, we actually have the armor bearer of Shaul, who when Shaul falls on his sword is a Amaleki, and David kills him for even facilitating the suicide of Shaul.
There you go. So that kind of proves the point, which is we can forgive the Moabites and create an archetype figure of kindness, because the Moabites and the Ammonites weren't kind to Israel as they were going through the desert, wandering through the wilderness. But Ruth becomes like the kindest person ever. We can find our ways with the Mitzrim, because after all, the average Egyptian was probably enslaved also. But the Amalekites, forget it. We have no place for the Amalekites.
They're bad news. But actually, I want to say about the Egyptians, the Torah actually gives a slightly different answer than what you just said, which probably was true also, that the average Egyptian subject had nothing to do with Pharaoh's oppression. But the Torah actually says, lo tita'ev mitzri ki ger hayita be'artzo, because you were a stranger in his land. Now, I think what that means is, yeah, it ended up really bad, but there was a time when Egypt was your rescue place.
Exactly.
Right,
And
they
so
were invited there, right?
you were invited there. You were in a
Adam-
terrible crisis. You were in a terrible crisis. You were starving to death, and the Egyptians helped you out. So I think that means something like, as crazy as this is, you know, you never forget when somebody does you a kindness, even if they later do something bad. It's almost like, you know, it's almost as if somebody were to say to you today, well, you know, lots of Jews prospered in Germany. Let's think wonderful things about the Germans, because lots of Jews prospered there. Yeah, well, it ended up really badly. But you know, the Torah seems to be saying that you should relate to the Egyptians as the people who helped you in the famine, not the people who enslaved you later.
Right. And look, you know, even on that, we all know of Jews who married Germans because their kindness. I have many stories of people who married their Gentile rescuers, you know, which will take us down a different path. But anyway, so you know, this idea that there are boundaries and that the boundaries themselves, you know, within the Bible itself are somewhat fluid, shall we say. Anyway, we've reached the end of our time. And you could see, you know, for everyone watching and listening, is how exciting it is, how great it is, how wonderful it is to be able to discuss these things. There's 74 mitzvot in this parsha. Each one has a story behind them, and each one gives up a rise to a set of debates. We want to, first of all, say to our friends at Machane Ramah, we hope you had a wonderful summer. Thank you for hosting our show all summer. This is going to be broadcast after you all are back. And to our friends and listeners in our communities, we want to say thank you for watching and listening. We hope to join you again. You join us again on another edition of Parasha Talk, and we say Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.